Before I start, I'd like to thank the few of you who are currently on the Patreon, as well as those of you who are subscribed or simply take the time to watch or listen to these videos. I really appreciate it. Over the past year, and especially during the past few months, I've been spending an increasing amount of time working on traditional art. And because of this, I figured I'd invest in a means of sharing the process of this kind of work in addition to the usual digital output on this channel. Since, as I've expressed a few videos ago, I think it's really important to share the art we make in as many ways as possible. So I want to live by this belief and document the many hours I spend with a pencil in hand. I thought I could use the process of this drawing as an opportunity to explore a few thoughts and perspectives that accompanied me throughout the time I spent on it. So maybe I'll start at the beginning and then just spiral out from there. I began this piece the same way I begin just about every drawing, which is by using messy, indistinct scribbling that I think of as a form of searching for interest on the page. And since I like to start on the page first, I initially didn't have any references or clear visual idea and no direct planning to start with. All I had going into this drawing was a collection of themes that have been floating around in my head and reoccurring in my journaling that would eventually compel me to explore and develop some kind of visual configuration of these concepts. And this then necessitated the need to sink deeply into a drawing. I don't think this is the case for everyone, but for me, all the impetus I really need for art to unfold are concepts and themes I find interesting and the growing impulse to investigate them through a drawing or through several drawings. So in taking this into account, when it comes to planning an artwork, I found through multiple attempts and failed or abandoned creative pursuits that if I strictly plan a drawing or painting before beginning it, then that'll only increase the odds that I'll either lose interest in sticking with it or I'll find myself forcing my hand with it and even torturing the piece as I tend to think about it. I find this to be especially true if the planning takes a form that's very similar to what the final artwork is intended to be, such as making drawings in preparation for a more involved yet similar drawing. I guess I just don't want to know what the final work might look like, because then the mystery of uncovering it through the process has been spoiled. But I do like to have certain concepts in mind and do a sort of loose planning process in other mediums. That way I can retain all the excitement of the act of discovery on the real thing. This is why discovery is a major guiding force for me when it comes to creativity. When you frame the act of creation as one of searching and figuring things out, your most useful trait is no longer your imaginative abilities, but rather your capacity for curiosity. If you decide to let discovery lead you in your art, you let go of a sense of commanding agency over your art, and you allow yourself to see the work transpire before your eyes and adapt to each challenge it poses. My belief is that both curiosity and the propensity for discovery should be the key driving factors behind interests you aspire towards, as opposed to persistence on particular outcomes. Because whether it be wanting to spend time on your art, developing new skills, making an income off your art, or making connections with people and having a career and so forth, it might not always be so helpful to go about doing things in such a way that they must lead to some external, hopeful endpoint, because it's often the case in life that our persistence that things end up as we strive for them to be hinders us the most in the event they don't. I haven't really talked about what I'm drawing here yet, so I wanted to give a bit of background on it in case anyone's interested. This drawing was my attempt at capturing a nocturne-like dream state. I wanted to investigate the idea of a nocturne in the form of a drawing, but without exploring or explicitly conveying too much about the earthly night. I tried to lean into the idea of composing a nocturne visually by pulling from my interest in piano literature and composing as an art form in music, which is where the concept of this genre in art originated. And something I did to help me with this idea was specifying to myself what qualities make a nocturne for me, and that ended up being the atmosphere, the mood, and the inclusion of unreal and dreamlike elements, but not so much any direct depiction of nighttime. So that's the general inspiration and ideation behind this drawing. And for those curious, in the end, the total working time on this piece was just over 43 hours. I typically prefer not to say what I believe my art is truly about at the deepest level. And if I want to comment on it beyond a surface level, I often try to find less vague ways to describe what my work is about than the background summation I just gave. But in trying to find a more direct way to phrase it, it began to dawn on me why I sometimes have trouble clearly distilling what my art is about to other people. And it's because, among other things, what my work is about is often some kind of emotive thought or aspect of experience that a linguistic description fails at conveying. That's why I attempt to make my description of these specific things in the form of an image, rather than through written or spoken means. I have to say that a slight concern of mine when discussing art is that I'm worried that to some extent I risk misconstruing what the work is about by translating it into language, or in other words, inflecting my own interpretation onto it so that the viewer isn't able to form their own original interpretation in the same way. And I don't think a true understanding of the meaning behind a visual artwork can even be conveyed or obtained through a verbal explanation. A verbal explanation can only provide a rough understanding. And my belief is that only emotional experiences with the art itself can convey the art's message purely without the lossy compromise of translation. That's not to say that we can't have both forms of expressing and interpreting art, but the degree of connection with the art that's possible is not equal between these forms. But I would love to hear an alternative perspective if anyone would like to have a conversation about this topic. This is just my take. In general, aside from the concepts and thematic material I have in mind as guideposts while working, I don't completely know all of the reasons why my art ends up looking the way it does, or why I make certain decisions throughout the process, or what my art even means in any ultimate sense. I think that it's generally assumed that the artist would be the best person to explain the meaning behind their own work. But I think I'm a little bit skeptical of this being true across the board, because in my own, albeit limited, experience, I only know so much about why my art is the way it is. Even though I have a bunch of clues or experiences in my life and have sort of made connections between tendencies in my art and these experiences, I can only know as much about my art as I do about myself. And with each new insight I have about me and who I am, time has only continued to reveal just how little I really understand myself, through things both minor and significant. And these qualities inevitably manifest in my art as visuals that are up to interpretation by everyone, including myself. My experiences have allowed me to develop a general idea of who I am, and by extension, what my art is about. But I always hold some reservations on the accuracy of this idea, because I don't fully trust my mental model of how things in the world are and what they mean. I think that just because things appear to be a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that they indeed are, and a contradictory experience is all that's needed to begin to question and reconstruct this model until it is adapted to every contradiction you're aware of. I want to avoid letting my idea of who I think I am lead me to believe that that's who I really am. So, for now, I am only left with hypotheses on what my art is about, and maybe I'm not the most trustworthy source for the meaning behind all the nuances and subtleties in my own art, any more than I am for the myriad subtleties that are me. In line with the thought from earlier that discovery is at the core of creativity, in my experience at least, I find it interesting to view the art practice as grounds for creating problems for yourself. Now, an initial thought to this is, why would I want to create more problems for myself? But what I mean is that the kinds of problems you can create in art aren't necessarily negative things to be avoided, and can instead be thought of as challenges, interesting predicaments that are worth investigating. When I remind myself that art gives me the chance to not only create or encounter these challenges, but also find solutions to them. Each component of your art, whether it be a single picture or an entire creative project, can feel like a satisfying puzzle that you've gifted to yourself. In fact, I almost feel like making or encountering problems to be solved is just part of the nature of creation. Like, for example, when you make a stroke on a blank page, a problem has been created whose solution may involve drawing another stroke to interact with it in a way you see fit. And in doing that, a new problem has been created where this time the solution might require the next stroke to react appropriately to the first two, or maybe a repositioning or complete removal of the prior strokes, and so on, until perhaps the last set of problems, where you determine whether or not the work is finished, or if further additions would create even more problems that unsolve the ones leading up to it. It's also like a balancing act of deciding how many problems do you want to intentionally leave unsolved, which paradoxically can be a solution itself. And what I love about drawing is presenting these problems to myself and asking, how could I solve this problem beautifully? How could I solve it unconventionally or in some other way? I try my best to solve them as beautifully as I can, but looking at things this way reveals that there are infinite subjective ways to solve the problems that the act of drawing inherently creates. Something that has continued to occur to me as I went into this drawing, as well as over the course of working on it, is a topic that I believe deserves its own video, which is the importance of listening to your gut, acting on your impulses, and honoring your urges, and doing so with a bit of resolve. And when I say your gut or your impulses, I'm talking about the sudden, occasional, or even persistent thoughts or feelings that arise in response to scenarios that require you to make decisions on what to do with your time and energy. The impulses I think are important to listen to are the ones based on our core emotional instincts, things that are personal in nature, such as when you're confronted with thoughts that appeal to or are rooted in your values, your interests, and are prompted by things that the body feels would be worth deciding to do rather than what we consciously conclude is the best thing to do. I think that across many different areas within art and in life, there are about 3 common ways in which we fail to honor these emotive impulses. And this is usually by either actively fighting against our impulses on certain matters because we've logically or rationally concluded otherwise, ignoring our impulses entirely by viewing them as less important factors to consider in our decision making, or letting what others say and do dictate what paths we should take or what decisions we should make without consulting our innate sensibilities on the matter. But my belief is that it serves you to honor these impulses, whether they're subtle or significant, especially in art, the thing that's all about what you want to do. When your body offers up something worth considering, which happens a lot more frequently than we tend to realize, such as a creative idea, a potential direction to take in a personal pursuit, a subject to explore, or something in particular you might want to learn or get into, I find that possibly the healthiest reaction to these impulses is to strike while the iron's hot. In my experience, if I let a prolonged amount of time pass without honoring these impulses, they either grow stale or they eat away at my sense of fulfillment due to my lack of action on them. I really believe our unconscious, or maybe some greater force, is trying to speak to us when we have these inklings, and that it's our duty to observe and follow these callings, because they're often in our best interests, even if our reasoning, conscious mind can't immediately see why. In fact, it's almost like the longer we let them sit or ignore them, the more time we give our rational mind to come up with reasons to dismantle and delegitimize the impulse. And your own experiences might confirm that we're really good at making projections and coming up with sound reasons as to why our gut is wrong and why a certain idea or endeavor isn't worth the time or effort. I've learned and am continuing to learn to trust and allow this sense of gravity I feel in these scenarios, because this gravity is what will inevitably pull me towards whatever the next subject of my attention will be. There's no need for me to exert any effort contrary to it, and I ignore this pull or fight against it at my own peril. So if, until now, you've mostly done otherwise in your art and in your personal aspirations, I strongly encourage you to begin listening to your gut. And to do this is to simply begin being curious, to follow your nose, and to let your interests guide you through each moment of uncertainty you face. And I think this process can take you pretty far. Well, not just far, I think it can take you all the way to the end. You can let it run forever. But I have to admit that all of this does raise the question, how can you manage to make any headway on anything merely by following your gut? Well, the reason I think it's possible to leave your artistic fate entirely in the hands of your impulses and still have a fulfilling relationship with your art is because, to some extent, only following your impulses is already how you do just about everything else in life. It's a baseline function. I say you should follow your impulses because remembering to do this circumvents the desire to be certain of the future or to control the outcomes of your actions. You never know what's going to happen in the future because the future doesn't exist. We can only guess what it might bring. But what does exist, and through which we make all of our decisions, is the present. And all we can do as we progress towards the imagined future, and as the actual present time unfolds before us, is to adapt to what happens moment to moment. There's no other way to do things, and we falter when we act as if there are exceptions to this, or when we convince ourselves that this doesn't apply to every individual human action at any scale, but it does. So in recognizing this, we can allow the truth of how we naturally make decisions be the method through which we approach the decisions in our art, rather than adapting to an assumption that things should be done otherwise. I don't know what the next chapter of my artistic development will look like, nor do I know how I'll get there or in how long. I don't know what skills or knowledge I will need to have learned in order to progress further. I don't know what my next several artworks will look like or how I'll arrive upon completing them. I didn't really know what this current drawing had in store for me as it unfolded, and I definitely didn't know what direction it would take in each session I worked on it. I don't even know with exact certainty how each stroke of the pencil will go down onto the page until the act has already become the past. I could make guesses about all of these future events and what the best course of action would be to achieve the results I desire in each scenario. But that's all I or anyone is ever capable of doing with time and potential events, guessing and having an idea of what might come next. And since the things we hope or expect to occur are merely predictions, basing our decisions off of these guesses, especially major ones, would be a bit like gambling with time, and it makes it increasingly likely that we'll lead ourselves astray. Of course, the more I do things, the more I develop experience in being able to predict what should or is likely to occur next with more confidence. But the simple fact is that, for all my experience and preparation, I can never truly know what will happen until it's already happening. And I find this lack of certainty freeing rather than worrying, since that's already how things work. Not knowing what could or should happen next frees you from the assumed responsibility of making the correct decision or the perfect decision to achieve a certain favorable outcome. And this allows you to feel free to make the decisions that feel right in the present, with the knowledge that you can always adjust course and react to the results of your choices after they've been made. Alright, this drawing is just about done now, and that's all I've prepared to talk about in this one. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, or if there's any topic that came up here that you think I could expand upon in a future video, or anything else you'd like to let me know. That's all. Thanks for listening.